The 15th of September 1941, in the pale, frozen light of early morning, the North Sea lay beneath a veil of cloud and mist. The cold wind off Norway's coast carried the smell of salt and oil, and far above that gray expanse, a lone German fighter sliced through the air. Its pilot was Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, a Luftwaffe veteran stationed at Bodø, northern Norway. His Messerschmitt Bf 109F shimmered faintly in the dawn, its engine humming a steady rhythm that echoed inside the cockpit. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, one of dozens he'd flown since the war began, scanning the empty sea for British reconnaissance planes or the occasional carrier, base strike group hunting, German shipping bound for Narvik and Trondheim. Fischer was 25 years old, already a combat veteran. He had flown over France and the Channel during the Battle of Britain, duelled Spitfires and Hurricanes, seen friends vanish in flame and sea. Now he was in the far north, assigned to protect the convoys bringing iron ore from Sweden and to intercept British aircraft threatening Germany's Arctic routes. On that September morning, the radio was quiet and the air thin and sharp. He checked his fuel, adjusted the oxygen feed, and scanned the horizon for movement. He was thinking of the warmth of the mess hall coffee that awaited him on return when a glint on the distant horizon caught his eye. 8 tiny specks of silver, glimmering faintly against the blue. At first he thought they were British fighters, perhaps a patrol of Hawker Sea Hurricanes, carrier-based escorts from one of the Royal Navy task forces operating off Norway. Their formation looked tight, disciplined, and their approach shallow. But as Fischer climbed slightly to gain advantage, he noticed their stubby fuselages and long, fixed landing gear. These weren't fighters. He realized it too late. They were British dive bombers, ferry swordfish from HMS Eagle, on a strike mission against German shipping off the Lofoten Islands. Each carried a single bomb under its belly, and, more dangerously, a rear gunner armed with twin .303 caliber Browning machine guns. Fischer smiled behind his oxygen mask. He had always considered the swordfish an antique, a slow canvas, winged relic. Easy prey for a modern fighter, he thought. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Bf 109 shuddered as it accelerated into a dive. The roar filled his ears. He came in fast, lining up behind the last aircraft in the British formation, the sun at his back, his guns primed and fingers tense. The moment felt simple: 1 pass, 1 kill, then home. He squeezed the trigger. Cannon shells streaked ahead, exploding in white bursts near the trailing plane. But before he could correct his aim, the world erupted in fire. All 8 dive bombers opened up at once. Their gunners, alert and trained, reacted instantly. Tracer fire lit the sky like ribbons of red lightning, converging on Fischer's Messerschmitt. The first burst tore through his port wing. The second shattered the canopy glass. Then came a blinding flash and a hammer-like impact against his head. 1.303 bullet, fired from one of those 8 British gunners, had found its mark. It pierced the plexiglass canopy and struck Fischer just above his left eye. His vision went white, then black. The fighter lurched violently, nose dropping toward the sea. Fischer's head lolled forward. His hands slipped from the stick, and for a moment he drifted into darkness. The Bf 109 entered a shallow dive, the wind screaming through the broken canopy. The British gunners watched from above as the German aircraft tipped upward briefly, then rolled and disappeared into the clouds below. To them, it was finished. They had seen dozens of enemy planes fall like that. They marked him down as a kill, turned toward the open sea, and continued their mission. But Fischer wasn't dead. Somewhere in that gray fog of pain and blood, a spark of consciousness remained. His head throbbed with unbearable pressure, and the left side of his face felt wet and cold. He could only see through his right eye, blurred by tears and blood. The canopy glass was shattered, the wind biting at his face, the smell of fuel thick in the cockpit. He reached for the control stick, barely able to grip it. The altimeter spun downward 3,000 meters, then 2. With instinct more than thought, he pulled back gently, easing the Messerschmitt out of its dive. The nose leveled. The engine coughed, but held. He had no idea where he was. His compass was cracked, the radio dead, the gauges erratic. Through the haze he glimpsed the North Sea beneath him, an endless gray carpet stretching to the horizon. Somewhere far to the northeast lay Norway and home. He thought briefly of dying there, plunging his crippled plane into the waves, ending the pain quickly. Many pilots had done the same when wounded beyond hope. The idea flickered in his mind like a candle, then went out. He remembered the faces of his squadron mates, the mechanics who kept his aircraft flying, the younger pilots he had trained. He was their senior officer. He couldn't just vanish. Dying now would mean nothing. Living meant everything. He decided to try. Bodø was over 300 miles away, across ocean and mountain. He had almost no oxygen, limited fuel, one functioning eye, and blood dripping into his mouth. But the Messerschmitt still responded to his touch, the Daimler-Benz engine groaning but alive. He trimmed the controls, pointed his nose northeast, and began the long journey home. The hours dragged on. Every minute felt like an eternity. The pain in his head was constant, pounding with each heartbeat. Sometimes he drifted in and out of consciousness, only to jolt awake as the aircraft began to dip. He spoke aloud to himself to stay alert, muttering navigation points and fuel estimates. The Arctic sky changed color as the morning stretched into afternoon, gray to pale blue, then to a dim orange glow as the sun dipped low. Below, waves smashed against the fjord cliffs of the Norwegian coast. He recognized a familiar landmark, the snow-covered peaks near Narvik. He was nearly there. As he approached Bodø airfield, the control tower crew spotted his battered plane. Smoke trailed from the engine, pieces of metal flapping loose. The ground crew ran to meet him as he landed hard, the wheels screeching and the tail bouncing twice before the aircraft came to rest. They expected to pull a corpse from the cockpit, but Fischer, drenched in blood, refused help until he could report to his commander. Standing shakily on the wing, he saluted, gave his after-action summary in a hoarse voice, and only then collapsed. Doctors said he wouldn't live through the night. The bullet had fractured his skull, damaging the optic nerve in his left eye. Infection seemed inevitable, but against the odds, Karl Fischer survived. Weeks passed, then months. He lay in a military hospital near Hamburg, his head bandaged, vision dim. For a long time he couldn't read or stand without vertigo, yet each day he forced himself to recover, lifting his head, walking the corridor, memorizing flight manuals. By spring 1942, He could see again with one eye and begged his superiors to let him return to duty. They refused at first, but his persistence wore them down. By late 1943, he was flying again, one-eyed, cautious, and slower, but still a pilot. He returned to northern Norway, flying defensive patrols over the Arctic convoys, escorting bombers leading young airmen half his age. He no longer chased glory. He told his men to survive. "Victory means nothing if you don't make it home," he'd say. When the war ended in 1945, Fischer was 30, weary, and half-blind. He returned to a ruined Germany and tried to rebuild his life. He found work as a mechanic, then opened a small machine parts workshop near Stuttgart. The years softened him. He hired other veterans, men who had lost limbs or homes or families. He treated them not as soldiers, but as brothers. War, he said, had taken enough from all of them. He married, raised 2 children, and tried to forget the past. But he never quite could. In the 1960s and 70s, as Germany and Britain rebuilt ties, Fischer began to write letters to British veterans' organizations. He wanted to learn more about that day over the North Sea, about the formation of 8 dive bombers he had attacked. He didn't know which gunner had fired the bullet that nearly killed him, only that someone had, and that he wanted to meet them, not to accuse, but to understand. It took years, but in 1982, a historian researching Arctic air operations found Fischer's name in Luftwaffe records and connected him with an aging British veteran named James Jim Halstead, a former rear gunner on a swordfish from HMS Eagle. They agreed to meet in southern England at a small air museum near Portsmouth. Fischer flew in from Germany, carrying a worn leather flying helmet, the same one he'd worn that September morning, still bearing a bullet hole above the left eye. When Halstead arrived, both men paused, studying each other. They were old now, gray and stooped, but the recognition was instant. They shook hands silently at first. Then Fischer spoke, his voice steady. "It seems, my friend, you nearly took my life." Halstead smiled faintly. "A lucky shot, I suppose. We thought you'd gone straight into the sea. None of us believed anyone could survive that." Fischer handed him the helmet. "This is your proof. 1 bullet in the right place. I flew 5 hours home with it." Halstead turned it over in his hands, tracing the ragged hole with his thumb. "You should have died that day," he said quietly. "I should have," Fischer agreed. But life had other plans. The 2 men talked for hours. Halstead described the tension of that mission, the fear of the Messerschmitt diving at them, the rush of firing back. Fischer told him of the agony, the long flight, the years of recovery. They found themselves laughing, not at the pain, but at the absurdity of it all, the thin line that had separated life from death, enemy from friend. When journalists asked Fischer later what it felt like to meet the man who had nearly killed him, he replied, "It felt like meeting an old comrade. We both survived what the war tried to take from us. There was no hate then, and there is none now." In the years that followed, Fischer and Halstead exchanged letters regularly. They met again in 1985 at a memorial service for Arctic convoy veterans. Standing side by side, they laid a wreath not for one nation or the other, but for all who had died in the frozen skies above the North Sea. Fischer spoke briefly, his voice calm and clear. "We fought because we were told to fight. We survived because we refused to die. But we live because we learned that the enemy is never the man, only the war. By the 1990s, Fischer had become a quiet advocate for reconciliation. He visited schools, spoke at museums, and told young Germans and Britons about the futility of hatred. His story appeared in magazines and documentaries, often titled The One-Eyed Pilot or The Flight from Death. He dismissed the dramatization. It wasn't heroism, he'd say. It was duty and a bit of luck. On September 22, 2000, nearly 59 years to the day after that fateful mission, Karl Fischer attended a commemorative dinner at the German Air Force Officers Club in Berlin. British veterans were invited guests. Halstead was too ill to attend, but sent a note. To Karl, the man who turned a bullet into friendship. Cheers, old chap. Fischer smiled when he read it. Later that evening, while speaking to a young pilot about perseverance, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He collapsed quietly, dying moments later of a heart attack at age 84. At his funeral in Stuttgart a week later, the attendees were a mixture of Luftwaffe and RAF veterans. 2 wreaths lay side by side, one adorned with the Iron Cross, the other with the Royal Air Force roundel. Halstead's message was read aloud. We fought as enemies, but remembered as men. Fischer's story spread through veteran circles, a symbol of endurance and reconciliation. The bullet that nearly killed him became part of his legacy. His helmet with the small, ragged hole now rests in a museum display case in northern Germany beside a plaque that reads, "Courage is not in killing, but in coming home." When asked once what he learned from that flight, Fischer answered simply, "That survival is not victory. Living with understanding is." He had flown half-blind across an endless ocean, bleeding and alone, driven only by duty and the faint hope of seeing home again. That flight defined him more than any medal or victory ever could. The men of the Royal Navy who shot at him, the German mechanics who patched his aircraft, the officers who doubted he'd fly again, all became threads in the same tapestry of history. Over the decades, time softened the lines of nationality and turned the story of one violent morning into a lesson about the endurance of the human spirit. Fischer never glorified the war. He despised the ideology that had led to it. He called himself a soldier, not a believer. In later interviews, he admitted that he felt more kinship with the British pilots he fought against than with some of his own wartime leaders. In his final years, children would sometimes ask him whether he hated the men who had shot him. He would laugh softly and say, "How could I? They gave me a second life. That bullet taught me the value of every breath." His friendship with Jim Halstead lasted until Halstead's death in 2007. Fischer's daughter later recalled that he kept Halstead's last letter on his desk, yellowed and folded. "We're both too old to fly now, Karl, but maybe in another sky, without uniforms, without flags, we'll share a pint instead of bullets." In that quiet line, the story of Karl Fischer found its meaning. He had begun the war as a proud young German pilot, convinced of his own invincibility. He ended it as a man who understood that courage was not about killing, but enduring, forgiving, and learning. The flight that should have been his last became the journey that defined his life. Over the North Sea, where cold winds still sweep the gray waters, The echoes of that morning linger. 8 British dive bombers, 1 determined German pilot, a single bullet, and a 5-hour struggle between death and survival. In those few moments of chaos, history created not just destruction, but understanding. Karl Fischer never saw himself as a hero. He was a survivor, an ordinary man placed in extraordinary circumstances. But through that survival, he offered proof that even in war's most brutal moments, humanity endures. The enemies of one generation can become the friends of the next, bound not by hate, but by memory and by respect. As the years pass and the witnesses fade, the story remains. A German pilot, a broken canopy, a trail of smoke across the morning sky, and the long, cold flight home. It is a story not of nations, but of will. The will to live, to forgive, and to remember. And somewhere, in the endless quiet above the sea, the wind still carries the faint echo of a single engine flying home.